Margaret Chin stood outside the tall glass doors of Steinway Hall, watching her breath fog up in the cold evening air. Her hands shook slightly, but not from the weather. Inside those doors was something she had dreamed about for 30 years. She pulled her old black dress down nervously and checked her reflection in the glass. The dress was simple, nothing fancy, but it was clean and pressed. She had bought it from a thrift store 3 months ago, specifically for this night. In her worn leather bag, she carried sheet music that meant everything to her. The pages were yellowed with age, and some had tape holding them together. These weren't just any songs. They were her grandmother's arrangements, written in faded pencil and ink. Her grandmother had been a pianist many years ago, before life got hard and she had to work in factories instead of playing music. Margaret worked as a cleaner at the city hospital. Every night she mopped floors, emptied trash bins, and wiped down surfaces. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing and cleaning. Her back ached from bending over to clean under beds and around medical equipment, but she never complained. She had 2 children to raise, and her husband worked construction during the day. The hospital job had one special benefit that nobody else knew about. After her shift ended at midnight, when the building was quiet and most patients were sleeping, Margaret would slip into the small chapel on the 3rd floor. There, in the corner, sat an old upright piano that was hardly ever used. The hospital had bought it years ago for services and special events, but it mostly sat silent. That's where Margaret had been teaching herself to play again. 3 nights a week, for the past 2 years, she would sit at that piano and practice. She had to be quiet so she wouldn't wake anyone. Her fingers would move carefully across the keys, playing the melodies her grandmother had taught her as a child. Sometimes she would cry while playing, remembering her grandmother's gentle hands, guiding her small fingers across the keys. Her grandmother had died when Margaret was only 12. Before that, every Sunday afternoon, they would sit together at the old piano in her grandmother's tiny apartment. Her grandmother would tell stories about the music, about the composers who wrote the pieces, and about her own dreams of playing in concert halls. She had been talented enough to perform professionally, but the Great Depression had changed everything. Instead of concert halls, she ended up working in clothing factories to help her family survive. Music lives in your heart, her grandmother used to say. It doesn't matter if you play in a palace or a basement. What matters is that you feel it and share it with the world. Margaret had carried those words with her through marriages, births, night shifts, and all the challenges that come with raising a family on limited income. She had always promised herself that someday, when things got easier, she would return to music. When her children were small, there was no time. When they were teenagers, there was no money for lessons or even a piano. But now, at 52, both her children were grown and living their own lives. 6 months ago, her husband had noticed her humming while she cooked dinner. He asked her about it, and she told him about the piano in the hospital chapel. She was embarrassed at first, thinking he might laugh at her for having such dreams at her age. Instead, he surprised her by saying, "Why don't you try playing for other people? There's that monthly recital downtown. I heard about it on the radio." The monthly amateur recital at Steinway Hall was famous in their city. Every 4th Tuesday of the month, local musicians could sign up to perform for Maestro Rossi, a former concert pianist who now taught at the prestigious Music Academy. People came from all over to either perform or listen. It was free to attend, but performers had to register in advance. Margaret had called the number 3 times before she finally got the courage to leave her name. The woman who answered sounded professional and polite, but Margaret could hear the surprise in her voice when she said she was 52 and worked at the hospital. Most performers were much younger, usually music students or people who had been playing professionally for years. Now, standing outside the hall, Margaret watched well-dressed people walking in. Women in elegant dresses and men in expensive suits carried instrument cases and thick folders of sheet music. Some looked like they were in their 20s, probably students from the Music Academy. Others appeared to be local musicians who performed. At restaurants and events around the city, a young woman with perfectly styled hair walked past Margaret, carrying a violin case that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. She was talking on her phone about her upcoming audition for the city orchestra. Behind her, a man in a tailored suit discussed his latest performance at a wedding where he charged $500 for 2 hours of piano music. Margaret felt out of place, like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. Her dress was clean but obviously inexpensive. Her shoes were comfortable work shoes, not the elegant heels the other women wore. Her hands showed the signs of hard work, with calluses and small scars from years of cleaning. She almost turned around and went home. She could hear her inner voice telling her she didn't belong here, that she was fooling herself if she thought she could play at the same level as these people. But then she remembered her grandmother's words about music living in the heart, and she remembered her husband's encouraging smile when she told him she had signed up to perform. Margaret took a deep breath and pushed open the glass doors. The lobby was warm and smelled like expensive perfume and fresh flowers. A woman at a registration table looked up at her with a polite but questioning expression. Margaret approached the table, trying to appear confident. "I'm here to perform tonight," Margaret said quietly. "My name is Margaret Chun." The woman looked through her list and found Margaret's name near the bottom. She was scheduled to perform last, after 11 other musicians. The woman handed her a small card with her performance number and explained that she should listen for her name to be called. Margaret found a seat in the back of the performance hall. The room was beautiful, with high ceilings and elegant lighting. The grand piano on stage looked like something from a movie, black and shiny and perfect. She had never played on anything so nice. The hospital piano was old and some of the keys stuck, but this instrument looked like it had been crafted by angels. As people filled the seats around her, Margaret noticed that most of them seemed to know each other. They talked about previous performances, upcoming concerts, and mutual friends in the music world. She felt invisible, which was both uncomfortable and oddly comforting. No one expected anything from her, which meant there was less pressure to impress anyone. The lights dimmed and Maestro Rossi walked onto the stage. He was older than Margaret had expected, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes. He wore a simple black suit and moved with the grace of someone who had spent his life around music. When he spoke, his voice was warm but professional. "Welcome to our monthly recital," he said. "Tonight we have 12 performers who will share their love of music with us. I encourage everyone to listen with open hearts and minds. Music is not a competition but a gift we give to each other." Margaret felt a little more relaxed after hearing his words. Maybe this wouldn't be as intimidating as she had feared. Maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this. The first performer was a young man in his early 20s, probably a student from the music academy. He walked confidently to the piano, adjusted the bench with practiced ease, and launched into a complex piece by Rachmaninoff. His fingers moved across the keys with impressive speed and precision. Margaret watched in amazement as he played passages that seemed impossible to her. The audience clapped politely when he finished, and Maestro Rossi made notes on his clipboard before offering some technical suggestions about phrasing. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. How could she possibly follow performances like this? She looked down at her simple sheet music, her grandmother's handwritten notes suddenly seeming childish compared to the thick, professionally printed scores the other performers carried. The second performer was a woman in her 30s who played violin. She wore a stunning red dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly salary. Her performance was flawless, full of dramatic flourishes and emotional intensity. She bowed gracefully when the audience applauded, and Margaret noticed several people in the front row nodding approvingly. These were clearly people who understood classical music at a level Margaret had never reached. As the evening continued, Margaret began to notice patterns in the audience. The people in the front rows seemed to know each other well. They whispered comments about the performances, sometimes nodding with approval, other times exchanging knowing looks that suggested they had opinions about what they were hearing. Many carried programs from other concerts and events showing They were regular attendees of the city's classical music scene. During the intermission, Margaret overheard conversations that made her feel even more out of place. Two women near her were discussing a recent performance by the city orchestra, comparing it to a version they had heard in New York. A man behind her was talking about his son's acceptance into a prestigious music conservatory, mentioning the cost of tuition as if it were pocket change. Margaret excused herself to use the restroom, partly because she needed to, but mostly because she needed a moment alone to calm her nerves. In the mirror, she saw a tired-looking woman in a simple dress, with hands that showed the wear of hard work. Her reflection looked nothing like the elegant women in the audience. When she returned to her seat, the performances had resumed. A teenage girl played a challenging piece on the cello, her technique so advanced that Margaret wondered how someone so young could have mastered such difficult music. The girl's parents sat in the front row, beaming with pride, and Margaret could see the expensive instrument case at their feet. The next performer was a man in his 40s who played jazz piano. His performance was more relaxed than the classical pieces, but his skill was obvious. He improvised sections that showed years of professional experience, and several people in the audience smiled and nodded along with the familiar rhythms. When he finished, the applause was warmer and more enthusiastic than it had been for the classical pieces. Margaret began to understand that this audience knew good music when they heard it. They weren't just being polite with their applause. They were genuinely appreciating the skill and artistry of the performers. This realization made her even more nervous. These people would know immediately if she wasn't good enough to be here. As the evening progressed, she noticed that fewer people were paying attention to the later performances. Some had started checking their phones discreetly. Others were gathering their coats and purses, clearly preparing to leave before the recital ended. Margaret realized that being scheduled last meant most people would be tired and ready to go home by the time her turn came. The performer before her was a young woman who played a beautiful piece on the flute. Her technique was excellent, and her musical interpretation showed real maturity despite her youth. But Margaret noticed that several people in the audience were now openly checking the time on their phones. Some had already left, citing early morning commitments or babysitter schedules. When the flute performance ended, the applause was noticeably quieter than it had been earlier in the evening. Margaret saw Maestro Rossi glance at his watch and then looked toward the back of the hall where she was sitting. His expression was professional but tired. He had been listening to performances for nearly 2 hours, and it was clear that he was ready for the evening to end. The woman at the registration table stood up and called Margaret's name. "Margaret Chun, you're our final performer this evening." Her voice carried to the back of the hall, but Margaret noticed that several more people chose that moment to gather their things and head toward the exit. Margaret stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She made her way down the aisle, past the remaining audience members, many of whom were now openly talking among themselves in hushed tones. She heard fragments of conversations about weekend plans and upcoming concerts, confirming that their attention had shifted away from the performances. As she approached the stage, Margaret caught sight of a group of younger performers near the front. They were probably students from the music academy, and she could see them looking at her with expressions that weren't exactly unkind, but weren't encouraging either. One of them glanced at her calloused hands and worn shoes, then whispered something to her friend. Margaret couldn't hear what was said, but the slight smile that followed made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She climbed the steps to the stage, feeling like every eye in the room was judging her. The stage lights were brighter than she had expected, and she could barely see the audience beyond the first few rows. In some ways, this was a blessing. She couldn't see the expressions of doubt or the people who were clearly ready to leave. The grand piano looked even more impressive up close. Its black surface was so polished that she could see her reflection in it. The keys were perfect, each one precisely positioned and gleaming white. She had never played on an instrument of this quality, and for a moment she wondered if she would even know how to make it sound good. Margaret placed her sheet music on the piano's music stand and immediately felt self-conscious about its appearance. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwritten notes were in pencil that had faded over the years. Compared to the crisp, professionally printed scores she had seen other performers use, her music looked like something from a different era. She adjusted the bench, trying to find the right height. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she took a deep breath to try to calm herself. From the audience, she could hear the quiet sounds of people settling into their seats, but also the subtle noises of others preparing to leave. She caught a glimpse of Maestro Rossi, who had his pen ready to make notes. But his posture suggested he was simply waiting for this final performance to end, so he could wrap up the evening. Margaret looked down at her grandmother's music, at the familiar notes and the loving annotations written in the margins. Her grandmother had written little reminders like, "Play this softly, like a whisper, and let this part sing with your heart." These notes had guided Margaret through countless practice sessions in the hospital chapel, and now they were all she had to cling to in this moment of terror and possibility. She placed her hands on the keys and felt their smooth, cool surface. The piano was perfectly tuned, unlike the slightly out-of-tune instrument she practiced on. For just a moment, she allowed herself to forget about the audience, the elegant people in their expensive clothes, and the young musicians who clearly belonged here in ways she never would. Instead, she thought about her grandmother, about the stories she used to tell about music living in the heart, and about all those quiet nights in the hospital chapel when it was just her and the piano, and the memories of better times. Margaret's hands hovered over the keys for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the hall was complete, but it wasn't the respectful quiet she had heard before other performances. This silence felt heavy, impatient. She could sense people shifting in their seats, probably wondering why she was taking so long to begin. Her grandmother's arrangement of Chopin's Nocturne in A-flat major lay open before her. The piece had been Margaret's favorite since childhood, but tonight it looked different under the bright stage lights. The pencil marks were so faded she could barely read some of the notes. Her grandmother had simplified parts of the original composition, making it more accessible for a young girl learning to play. At the time, Margaret had thought these changes made the piece more beautiful, more personal. Now she worried they would sound amateur to these sophisticated ears. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her grandmother's voice. "Don't think about the notes, dear one," she used to say. "Think about the story the music wants to tell. Every piece has a heart, and your job is to help people hear it." Margaret pressed the first key, and the sound that emerged was pure and clear. The piano responded to her touch with a richness she had never experienced on the old hospital instrument. Even that single note seemed to carry more weight, more possibility than she had expected. She played the opening phrase slowly, carefully. Letting each note ring out in the silence, the piece began quietly as Chopin had intended. Margaret's interpretation started with the gentleness of a lullaby, the same way her grandmother had taught her 30 years ago. But as her fingers found their rhythm on the unfamiliar keys, something began to change. The muscle memory of countless late-night practice sessions took over, and her nervousness started to fade. She had played this piece hundreds of times in the hospital chapel, always mindful of keeping the volume low so she wouldn't disturb anyone. But this piano didn't require her to hold back. When she pressed the keys, they responded with exactly the sound she had always imagined in her mind, but could never quite achieve on the old, upright piano. The melody began to flow more naturally, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the music. She started to forget about the audience, about the elegant people in their expensive clothes, about the young musicians who clearly belonged here more than she did. Instead, she began to remember why she had fallen in love with this piece in the first place. Her grandmother had told her that this nocturne was about longing, about the quiet moments when people dream of better times. "It's about hope," she had said, "but also about accepting what life gives you." Margaret had never fully understood what that meant until now, sitting on this stage, playing music that had sustained her through decades of hard work and sacrifice. As the piece progressed, Margaret's playing became more confident. She started to add subtle variations that she had discovered during her practice sessions, small changes in timing and emphasis that made the music feel more personal. These weren't the kind of technical flourishes she had heard from the other performers tonight. Instead, they were emotional interpretations, ways of playing that came from lived experience rather than formal training. The nocturne moved into its more complex middle section, where Chopin had written passages that required both hands to work independently. Margaret had struggled with these parts for months, practicing them over and over until her fingers could find the right keys even in the dark chapel. Now, under the stage lights, her hands moved with confidence she didn't know she possessed. She could feel the music building, not just in volume, but in emotional intensity. This was the part of the piece where her grandmother's arrangement differed most from the original. Instead of Chopin's elaborate ornamentation, her grandmother had written simpler but more heartfelt passages. Margaret had always loved these sections because they seemed to speak directly to her soul. As she played, memories began to surface. She remembered her grandmother's hands, weathered from factory work but still graceful on the piano keys. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told about her own dreams of performing, dreams that had been set aside for family and survival. She remembered the promise she had made to herself as a child, that someday she would play music for other people, not just for herself. The music began to tell the story of her own life. The quiet passages spoke of the early years of marriage, when money was tight and dreams seemed impossible. The more dramatic sections reflected the challenges of raising children while working night shifts, the exhaustion and worry that came with trying to provide for a family. But throughout it all, there was the underlying melody of hope, the belief that music would always be there when everything else seemed difficult. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't stop playing. The emotion in the music wasn't sadness exactly. It was something deeper, more complex. It was the feeling of a life fully lived, with all its struggles and small victories. It was the recognition that even the hardest times had led to moments of beauty. Like this one, the piano responded to every nuance of her playing. When she wanted the music to whisper, it whispered. When she needed it to sing, it sang with a voice that filled the entire hall. She had never played on an instrument that could capture such a range of emotion, and she found herself exploring sounds and feelings she had never been able to express on the hospital piano. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Margaret realized something had changed in the hall. The restless shifting had stopped. The quiet conversations had ended. Even the people who had been preparing to leave seemed to have settled back into their seats. She couldn't see the audience clearly because of the stage lights, but she could feel their attention in a way she had never experienced before. The music was speaking to them, just as her grandmother had always said it would. It didn't matter that Margaret's dress was simple or that her hands showed the signs of hard work. It didn't matter that she hadn't been trained at a prestigious music academy or that she couldn't afford expensive sheet music. What mattered was the story the music was telling and the authentic emotion she was bringing to every note. Margaret played the final phrases with a tenderness that came from deep within her heart. This was music that had sustained her through 30 years of dreams deferred, and now it was finally being shared with others. She let the last note ring out in the silence, holding the sustained pedal so the sound would linger in the air like a prayer. When the note finally faded, Margaret lifted her hands from the keys and sat perfectly still. She had given everything she had to this performance, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for the audience's response. For a moment, the hall was completely silent, and Margaret wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Then she heard it. It started as a single pair of hands clapping, then another, then several more. The applause grew stronger and more enthusiastic than any she had heard during the entire evening. People were not just clapping politely. They were responding with genuine emotion to what they had just experienced. The applause continued to grow, but Margaret barely heard it at first. She was still lost in the music, still feeling the emotions that had poured through her fingers and into the piano. Her hands remained on the keys, not because she was going to play more, but because she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The piano had become an extension of her soul, and now she felt reluctant to break that connection. Slowly, she became aware of the sounds around her. The clapping wasn't the polite, brief applause she had heard after other performances. This was different. It was sustained, enthusiastic, and she could hear voices mixed in with the clapping. Someone near the front was saying, "Beautiful," and another voice called out, "Bravo!" These were not the kind of responses she had expected. Margaret finally lifted her hands from the keys and turned to face the audience. The stage lights were still bright, but she could see more clearly now. People were standing up. Not just one or two, but most of the audience was on their feet, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. She saw faces that looked moved, touched by what they had just heard. Some people were wiping their eyes, and others were smiling with the kind of joy that comes from experiencing something truly special. But the most remarkable sight was Maestro Rossi. Throughout the entire evening he had remained seated, taking notes and maintaining his professional composure. Now he was standing, his notebook forgotten on his chair, his hands raised in applause. His expression was one of complete astonishment, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just witnessed. The young musicians who had performed earlier were also standing and clapping. The same students who had whispered about her appearance and seemed to doubt her ability to belong here were now looking at her with obvious respect. The woman who had played violin in the red dress was nodding her head in appreciation, and the jazz pianist was clapping with the enthusiasm of someone who recognized real artistry when he heard it. Margaret stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling unsteady. She had never experienced anything like this before. During her practice sessions in the hospital chapel, she had sometimes imagined what it would be like to play for an audience, but she had never dreamed of a response like this. She gave a small, hesitant bow, not sure if that was the right thing to do. The applause continued, and Margaret noticed that people were not just clapping, but were genuinely moved by what they had experienced. She could see it in their faces, in the way they were looking at her. These were people who attended concerts regularly, who had heard professional musicians perform, and they were responding to her music as if it had touched something deep inside. And Maestro Rossi began walking toward the stage, his steps deliberate and purposeful. Margaret felt a moment of panic, wondering if he was going to criticize her performance or point out technical errors she had made. But as he got closer, she could see that his expression was one of wonder, not disapproval. He climbed the steps to the stage and approached her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for established artists. When he spoke, his voice carried across the hall, and the audience quieted to hear his words. "In 40 years of teaching and performing," he said, "I have heard thousands of musicians play that piece. But I have never heard it played with such genuine emotion, such authentic understanding of what Chopin was trying to express." He paused, looking directly at Margaret. "You didn't just play the notes, you told us a story with your heart." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had been so focused on not making mistakes, on trying to prove she belonged here, that she hadn't fully realized what she had actually accomplished. She had shared her grandmother's music, her own story, and somehow it had reached these people. In a way that technical perfection never could, the maestro continued. "Tell me about your training. Where did you study? Who was your teacher?" His questions were asked with genuine curiosity, not the polite interest she had expected. Margaret found her voice, though it came out quieter than she intended. "My grandmother taught me when I was little," she said. She was a pianist, but she had to stop playing professionally during the Depression. She worked in factories instead, but she never stopped loving music. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Margaret continued, "I work at the hospital, cleaning floors and rooms. But after my shift, I practice on the piano in the chapel. I've been teaching myself to play her arrangements using the sheet music she left me." A murmur went through the audience. The idea that someone could develop such skill through self-teaching and practice on a hospital piano seemed almost impossible to them. But they had just heard the proof with their own ears. Maestro Rossi asked to see her sheet music, and Margaret handed him the yellowed pages with her grandmother's handwritten notes. He studied them carefully, reading the penciled annotations and the simplified passages that had been adapted for a young student decades ago. "This is remarkable," he said, loud enough for the audience to hear. "These arrangements show real musical understanding. Your grandmother was clearly a gifted musician." He looked up at Margaret. "And you have honored her legacy beautifully." The audience erupted in applause again, but this time it was different. Before, they had been responding to the music itself. Now they were responding to the story behind it, to the understanding that they had witnessed something rare and precious. They had seen someone who had kept music alive despite difficult circumstances, who had found a way to share her gift with the world. Margaret saw people in the audience wiping away tears openly. Now, the woman in the red dress was crying, and even some of the young music students looked emotional. The jazz pianist was shaking his head in amazement, and several older audience members were nodding with recognition, as if they understood the sacrifices and dedication it had taken to reach this moment. One elderly woman in the front row called out, "Thank you for sharing that with us. It was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." Her comment sparked a wave of similar responses from throughout the audience. People were saying things like, "Incredible, so moving," and "That touched my heart." Margaret realized that something fundamental had changed in the room. At the beginning of the evening, she had been the outsider, the person who clearly didn't belong among these sophisticated music lovers. Now she was the center of attention, but not in the way she had feared. She wasn't being judged or criticized. She was being celebrated. The maestro was still examining her sheet music, and Margaret could see him making connections between the original composition and her grandmother's adaptations. "These changes," he said, "they don't just make the piece easier to play. They make it more personal, more emotionally accessible. Your grandmother understood something that many professional musicians miss." He looked out at the audience then, back at Margaret. "Music is not about perfection," he announced. "It's about communication. It's about sharing human experience through sound. Tonight, we have heard a perfect example of what music can be when it comes from the heart." The standing ovation that followed was longer and more enthusiastic than anything Margaret had ever imagined. But more than the applause, it was the faces in the audience that told her everything she needed to know. These people had been moved by her music, had felt the story she was telling, had understood the love and dedication that had gone into every note. Margaret stood on the stage, overwhelmed by the response, but also filled with a deep sense of satisfaction. She had done what her grandmother had always encouraged her to do. She had let the music speak from her heart, and it had reached the hearts of others. When the applause finally began to die down, Margaret felt like she was living in a dream. She had spent so many years imagining what it would be like to play for an audience, but she had never dared to hope for a response like this. The faces looking up at her from the audience were filled with genuine appreciation and emotion, not the polite tolerance she had expected. Maestro Rossi was still holding her grandmother's sheet music, studying it with the careful attention he might give to a rare manuscript. He looked up at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read, then back at the music, then at her again. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet hall, "I need to ask you something important. Are you currently taking lessons? With anyone?" Margaret shook her head, feeling suddenly embarrassed. "No, sir, I can't afford private lessons. I've been teaching myself, using books from the library and watching videos online when I can." A murmur went through the audience. The idea that someone could develop such skill without formal training seemed to amaze them. Maestro Rossi nodded thoughtfully, as if this information confirmed something he had suspected. "What you've accomplished on your own is remarkable," he said. "But I can hear the potential for so much more. Your musical instincts are extraordinary, and your emotional understanding of the music is at a level that many of my advanced students haven't reached." Margaret wasn't sure where this conversation was leading, but she could feel the attention of everyone in the hall focused on their exchange. She noticed that even the people who had been preparing to leave earlier were now sitting forward in their seats. Listening intently, the maestro continued, "I would like to offer you a place in my advanced adult program. It's a small class only, 6 students, and we focus on developing individual musical voice rather than just technical skills. He paused, looking directly at her. There would be no charge for the lessons. What you have to offer is too valuable to be limited by financial considerations. Margaret felt her knees go weak. She had to grip the edge of the piano to steady herself. A scholarship to study with Maestro Rossi was something she had never even dared to dream about. Students paid hundreds of dollars for private lessons with him, and his advanced programs had waiting lists years long. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Are you sure? I mean, I work nights at the hospital and I'm not trained like your other students. That's exactly why I want you in. The program, the maestro replied. Your different background, your life experiences, the way you've learned to find music in difficult circumstances, these things give you something that can't be taught in a traditional classroom. You have authenticity, and that's becoming increasingly rare in classical music. The audience erupted in spontaneous applause at this announcement. Margaret looked out at the faces and saw genuine happiness for her success. The same people who had barely noticed her when she walked in were now celebrating her achievement as if she were a close friend, but the maestro wasn't finished. There's something else, he said, raising his hand to quiet the applause. Next month, we're hosting a special evening concert featuring adult students and community musicians. It's a formal event with an audience that includes some of the city's most prominent music supporters. I would like you to be our featured performer. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. A featured performance at a formal concert was beyond anything she had imagined. I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that, she said quietly. You're more ready than you know, the maestro assured her. What you played tonight had more emotional depth and musical understanding than many professional performances. I've heard. Yes, we can work on technique and help you expand your repertoire, but your ability to connect with an audience is already at a professional level. The woman in the red dress who had performed earlier suddenly stood up. Excuse me, she called out, but I have to say something. She looked directly at Margaret. I've been playing violin for 20 years and I've never heard a performance that moved me the way yours did tonight. If I were you, I would absolutely take this opportunity. Her comment sparked a wave of similar responses from throughout the audience. The jazz pianist called out, "That was the most honest musical performance I've heard in years." Several other musicians nodded in agreement, and audience members began sharing their own reactions. An elderly gentleman in the front row stood up slowly. Young lady, he said, his voice trembling with emotion, I've been coming to these recitals for 10 years and I've never heard anything like what you just played. You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. She had come to this recital hoping simply to not embarrass herself, to prove that she belonged here even in some small way. She had never imagined that her music could touch people so deeply, that her story could resonate with so many different people. The maestro stepped closer to her. Margaret, I want you to understand something. What happened here tonight doesn't happen often. You didn't just play music. You shared a piece of your soul with us. That's what real artistry is about, he gestured to the audience. Look at these faces. These people have heard hundreds of performances, but they're responding to yours because it was genuine. It came from a place of truth, from real experience and deep emotion. Margaret looked out at the audience again, and what she saw there finally convinced her. These weren't just polite music lovers offering encouragement. They were people who had been genuinely moved by her music, who had felt something real and powerful in her performance. I accept, she said, her voice stronger now. I accept the scholarship, and I accept the invitation to perform at the concert. The audience's response was immediate and overwhelming. People leaped to their feet, applauding and cheering as if she had just announced her engagement or graduation. The sound filled the hall, and Margaret felt surrounded by warmth and acceptance, in a way she had never experienced before. As the applause continued, people began approaching the stage. The woman in the red dress was the first to reach her, extending her hand with a warm smile. I'm Linda, she said. I teach violin at the Music Academy, and I just wanted to say that your performance was absolutely beautiful. I hope we can be friends. More people followed, each wanting to introduce themselves and share their reactions to her performance. The elderly gentleman who had spoken earlier turned out to be a retired music professor who had taught at the university for 30 years. In all my years of teaching, he told her, I've rarely encountered such natural musical instinct. Your grandmother would be very proud. The young music students who had initially seemed skeptical now approached her with obvious respect. One of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 20, said, I've been playing piano since I was 5, but I've never made music sound like that. Could you maybe teach me how to play with more feeling? Margaret laughed, still hardly believing. What was happening? I'm not sure I can teach what I don't fully understand myself, she said, but I'd be happy to try. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, many stopped to speak with Margaret one more time. They shared their contact information, invited her to other musical events, and made it clear that she was now considered part of the local music community, Maestro. Rossi was the last to speak with her before she left. Margaret, he said, I want you to know that what happened tonight changed something for all of us. You reminded us that music isn't about perfection or prestige. It's about human connection, about sharing our stories with each other. He handed her a card with information about the advanced program and the upcoming concert. I'll see you next week for your first lesson, and Margaret, don't change anything about the way you approach music. Your authenticity is your greatest strength. As Margaret walked out of Steinway Hall that night, she felt like a completely different person than the one who had entered just a few hours. Earlier, she was no longer just a hospital cleaner who happened to play piano. She was a musician who happened to work at a hospital, and that distinction made all the difference in the world.